These are the SUVs that headlines claim will be banned in 2026. And car owners are shocked, but probably not for the reason you think. Social media has been full of panic lately about SUVs being banned, trucks becoming illegal, and gas-powered vehicles disappearing from American roads next year. Comment sections overflow with people ready to sell their Tahoes and dump their Expeditions because they're convinced the government is coming for their SUVs. I spent the last week digging through actual federal regulations, state laws, manufacturer announcements, and legal filings. And what I found is going to surprise you. The truth about 2026 SUV bans turns out to be a lot more complicated than the headlines suggest. And honestly, a lot less scary for most owners. No hype, no panic, just what's actually happening, what's actually changing, and what you need to know if you own or want to buy a full-size SUV. The only confirmed, verified, actually happening restriction for 2026 involves two vehicles most people aren't even worried about. Ford Escape and Lincoln Corsair won't be sold in 6 states starting with the 2026 model year. And those states are California, New York, Massachusetts, Vermont, Oregon, and Washington. Ford stated these vehicles meet emissions requirements everywhere, except the 6 states that imposed additional emission requirements for 2026, which meant Ford didn't pursue CARB certification for these specific models. That's the entire list of confirmed emissions-related vehicle restrictions, just 2 compact crossovers. Not the Tahoe, not the Expedition, not the Escalade. Here's the critical distinction that most coverage misses entirely. This isn't a ban on ownership. If you already own a Ford Escape in California, you can keep driving it, register it, and insure it without any problems. You just won't be able to walk into a California dealership and buy a new 2026 model. That's the full extent of it. And that's when you start to wonder where all the panic about full-size SUVs actually came from. The biggest regulatory hammer that was supposed to force automakers to build more efficient vehicles doesn't exist anymore. CAFE, which stands for Corporate Average Fuel Economy, has been around for decades and worked like this. If an automaker's fleet average fell below the required fuel economy, they paid a civil penalty of $17 per vehicle for every 1/10 of a mile per gallon they missed. Sounds small on paper, but across millions of vehicles, it added up fast. Between model years 2011 and 2020, manufacturers paid over $1.1 billion in CAFE penalties, which meant real money and real consequences. July 4th, 2025 changed everything. Section 40,006 of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act reset those civil penalties to $0, not reduced, but completely eliminated. The 2026 CAFE requirements technically remain on the books at around 49 miles per gallon fleet-wide, roughly 42.4 for light trucks including SUVs, but with no financial penalty for missing those targets, the practical enforcement mechanism is gone. A proposal from the Trump administration in December 2025 would roll back fleet-wide fuel economy targets to 34.5 miles per gallon by 2031, though that hasn't been finalized yet. When you hear that 2026 standards will kill SUVs, understand that the primary enforcement for those standards was just gutted. California generates most of the confusion, so let's break down what the Advanced Clean Cars 2 program actually requires. Starting with model year 2026, 35% of new vehicle sales in California must be zero-emission vehicles. 35% of new vehicle sales in California must be zero-emission vehicles. 35% of new vehicle sales in California must be zero-emission vehicles. 35% of new vehicle sales in California must be zero-emission vehicles. 35% of new vehicle sales in California must be zero-emission vehicles. 35% of new vehicle sales in California must be zero-emission vehicles. 35% of new vehicle sales in California must be zero-emission vehicles. 35% of new vehicle sales in California must be zero-emission vehicles. 35% of new vehicle sales in California must be zero-emission vehicles. 35% of new vehicle sales in California must be zero-emission vehicles. 35% of new vehicle sales in California must be zero-emission vehicles. 35% of new vehicle sales in California must be zero-emission vehicles. 35% of new vehicle sales in California must be zero-emission vehicles. 35% of new vehicle sales in California must be zero-emission vehicles. 35% of new vehicle sales in California must be zero-emission vehicles. 35% of new vehicle sales in California must be zero-emission vehicles. 35% of new vehicle sales in California must be zero-emission vehicles. 35% of new vehicle sales in California must be zero-emission vehicles. 35% of new vehicle sales in California must be zero-emission vehicles. 35% of new vehicle sales in California must be zero-emission vehicles. 35% of new vehicle sales in California must be zero-emission vehicles. 35% of new vehicle sales in California must be zero-emission vehicles. 35% of new vehicle sales in California must be zero-emission vehicles. 35% of new vehicle sales in California must be zero-emission vehicles. 35% of new vehicle sales in California must be zero-emission vehicles. 35% of new vehicle sales in California must be zero-emission vehicles. 35% of new vehicle sales in California must be zero-emission vehicles. 35% of new vehicle sales in California must be zero-emission vehicles. 35% of new vehicle sales in California must be zero-emission vehicles. 35% of new vehicle sales in California must be zero-emission vehicles. 35% of new vehicle sales in California must be zero-emission vehicles. 35% of new vehicle sales in California must be zero-emission vehicles. 35% of new vehicle sales in California must be zero-emission vehicles. 35% of new vehicle sales in California must be zero-emission vehicles. 35% of new vehicle sales in California must be zero-emission vehicles. 35% of new vehicle sales in California must be zero-emission vehicles. 35% of new vehicle sales in California must be zero-emission vehicles. 35% of new vehicle sales in California must be zero-emission vehicles. 35% of new vehicle sales in California must be zero-emission vehicles. 35% of new vehicle sales in California must be zero-emission vehicles. 35% of new vehicle sales in California must be zero-emission vehicles. 35% of new vehicle sales in California must be zero-emission vehicles. 35% of new vehicle sales in California must be zero-emission vehicles. 35% of new vehicle sales in California must be zero-emission vehicles. 35% of new vehicle sales in California must be zero-emission vehicles. 35% of new vehicle sales in California must be zero-emission vehicles. 35% of new vehicle sales in California must be zero-emission vehicles. 35% of new vehicle sales in California must be zero-emission vehicles. 35% of new vehicle sales in California must be zero-emission vehicles. 35% of new vehicle sales in California must be zero-emission vehicles. 35% of new vehicle sales in California must be zero-emission vehicles. 35% of new vehicle sales in California must be zero-emission vehicles. 35% of new vehicle sales in California must be zero-emission vehicles. 35% of new vehicle sales in California must be zero-emission vehicles. 35% of new vehicle sales in California must be zero-emission vehicles. 35% of new vehicle sales in California must be zero-emission vehicles. 35% of new vehicle sales in California must be zero-emission vehicles. 35% of new vehicle sales in California must be zero-emission vehicles. 35% of new vehicle sales in California must be zero-emission vehicles. 35% of new vehicle sales in California must be zero-emission vehicles. 35% of new vehicle sales in California must be zero-emission vehicles. 35% of new vehicle sales in California must be zero-emission vehicles. 35% of new vehicle sales in California must be zero-emission vehicles. 35% of new vehicle, and that percentage increases each year until reaching 100% by 2035. Read that again because most people miss the math. 35% of new vehicle sales must be zero emission, which means 65% can still be conventional gas-powered vehicles, including SUVs, including full-size V, 8-powered, 13 miles per gallon. SUVs, if that's what the manufacturer wants to sell. ACC2 functions as a manufacturer sales mix requirement that tells automakers what percentage of their California sales must be electric. It does not tell consumers they cannot buy a gas-powered Tahoe, and those are completely different things. A Chevrolet dealer in Los Angeles can absolutely sell you a brand new 2026 Suburban, and a Cadillac dealer in San Francisco can absolutely sell you a 2026 Escalade. The manufacturer just needs to balance that sale against their overall ZEV percentage. Here's where it gets complicated though. On June 12, 2025, President Trump signed Congressional Review Act resolutions that revoked the EPA waivers allowing California to set these stricter standards, and California, along with 10 other states, immediately filed a lawsuit. A ruling is expected in early 2026, which creates genuine uncertainty about ACC2's legal status. But even if ACC2 survives that legal challenge and remains fully in effect, it still doesn't ban any specific SUV model from being sold because it's a manufacturer quota system rather than a consumer restriction. 13 states plus Washington, D.C. have adopted California's ACC2 standards at various levels, and combined with California, these states represent approximately 40% of U.S. new vehicle sales. Starting model year 2026, with that 35% ZEV requirement, you'll find California, Vermont, Oregon, Washington, New York, and Massachusetts. Starting model year 2027, the list expands to Colorado, Maryland, Delaware, New Mexico, New Jersey, Rhode Island, and Washington, D.C., with several of those states capping their requirements at 82%, rather than going all the way to 100%. Virginia reverted to federal standards as of January 1st, 2025, and Connecticut withdrew its ACC2 proposal entirely. In every single one of these states, you will still be able to buy gas-powered SUVs. The regulations affect what percentage of an automaker's sales must be electric, not which vehicles consumers are allowed to purchase. What about all those SUVs the headlines claim are being discontinued? Let me walk through the actual production status of every major full-size SUV on the market. Chevrolet Tahoe is confirmed for 2026 with production that started September 8th, 2025, and a starting price of $62,995. Chevrolet Suburban is confirmed with minor updates only and still rolling off the line. Cadillac Escalade is confirmed starting at $90,295, and while they did drop the diesel option, that decision came from low consumer demand rather than emissions regulations. GMC Yukon and Yukon XL are both confirmed, and Yukon sales actually grew 22% in the first half of 2025, which isn't exactly the trajectory of a vehicle on death's door. Ford Expedition is confirmed, and they actually redesigned it for 2025 with a 440 horsepower twin-turbo V6, and no manufacturer invests in a major redesign for a vehicle about to be banned. Lincoln Navigator is confirmed with electrified variants coming eventually while the current generation continues. Toyota Land Cruiser is confirmed running a hybrid Turbo 4, making 326 horsepower and getting 22 to 25 miles per gallon. Toyota Sequoia is confirmed with a hybrid-only powertrain, now producing 437 horsepower. Nissan Armada is confirmed and actually just received a redesign with a twin-turbo V6 making 425 to 460 horsepower. Every single major full-size SUV continues production for 2026. Some vehicles are being discontinued for 2026, but the reasons have nothing to do with emissions bans. Cadillac XT6 is gone because Cadillac is making room for EVS in their lineup, a business decision rather than a regulatory mandate. Kia Soul is gone because sales collapsed from 154,000 units in 2016 down to just 52,000 by 2024. The standalone Jeep Wagoneer is being discontinued while the Grand Wagoneer continues, which amounts to lineup consolidation. Nissan Ariya is gone due to weak sales combined with tariff pressures. Acura ZDX is gone after selling just 395 units in September 2025. And that's not a typo, 395 vehicles. When manufacturers discontinue vehicles, it's almost always about sales volume, profitability, or strategic direction, rather than government mandates. One piece of misinformation keeps appearing in every discussion about this topic. People claim the gas guzzler tax will make SUVs unaffordable, but that's not how the law works at all. The gas guzzler tax established in 1978 applies only to passenger cars, not SUVs, not trucks, not minivans. When Congress wrote the law, these vehicle types were rarely used for personal transportation, so they exempted them entirely, and that exemption still exists today. The Cadillac Escalade V gets 13 miles per gallon combined and pays no gas guzzler tax. The Rolls-Royce Cullinan, with its V12 engine, gets 12 miles per gallon combined and pays no gas guzzler tax. The Ferrari Purosangue gets 13 miles per gallon combined and pays no gas guzzler tax. Meanwhile, a Chevrolet Corvette Z06, which is smaller, lighter, and actually more fuel efficient than some of those SUVs, faces a $2,600 to $3,000 gas guzzler tax because it's classified as a passenger car. The tax structure literally incentivizes buying large SUVs over sports cars, which is the opposite of what most people assume. If you want to see what genuine regulatory pressure on SUVs looks like, Europe provides useful contrast. The EU's 2025 to 2029 CO2 fleet target sits at 93.6 grams per kilometer, and missing that target costs 95 euros per gram of exceedance per vehicle sold. Industry analysts estimate potential fines of 16 billion euros across the industry, which is real money with real consequences, unlike the zeroed out US CAFE penalties. Paris took direct aim at SUVs in September 2024, following a referendum held in February of that year. Vehicles weighing over 1,600 kilograms now pay 18 euros per hour to park in the city center, while lighter vehicles pay just 6 euros, which means parking for 6 hours costs 225 euros for an SUV versus 75 for a smaller car. London's ultra-low emission zone covers all 32 boroughs and charges £12.50 daily for non-compliant vehicles. Diesel vehicles need to meet Euro 6 standards, typically meaning registered after September 2015, while petrol vehicles need Euro 4, typically after 2005. Birmingham and Bristol charge £8 to £9 daily. But here's the thing about Europe. Even with all these restrictions, SUVs are not banned there either. They face financial penalties and access restrictions, but vehicles meeting emissions standards or paying the charges remain legal to own and operate. No US regulation, federal or state, does any of the following in 2026. No regulation bans you from owning an SUV, prevents you from registering an SUV, makes it illegal to drive an SUV on public roads, or creates emissions testing that specifically fails SUVs. State emissions testing programs like California's Smog Check, Texas's 17-county system, and Colorado's Denver Metro inspections apply equally to all gasoline vehicles based on model year, with no SUV-specific failure criteria. Weight-based registration fees in states like Washington, Maryland, and Michigan add roughly $50 to $150 annually for heavier vehicles. But that's a fee rather than a restriction. New York City's congestion pricing launched January 5th, 2025, charging a $9 peak toll for passenger vehicles entering Manhattan below 61st Street. That's a tolling system applying to all vehicles equally rather than an emissions ban. What's actually happening with SUVs in 2026 comes down to a few verified facts. Manufacturers face tightening emissions standards on paper, but the enforcement mechanism through CAFE penalties has been eliminated entirely. California's ACC2 creates sales quotas for automakers rather than purchase restrictions for consumers, and its legal status is currently being litigated in federal court. The only confirmed vehicle restriction involves 2 compact crossovers, not full-size SUVs. Every major full-size SUV, including Tahoe, Suburban, Escalade, Yukon, Expedition, Navigator, Land Cruiser, Sequoia, and Armada, is confirmed continuing production for 2026. The viral claim that SUVs will be banned from American roads in 2026 is demonstrably false. The regulatory landscape is shifting, and genuine pressures are pushing the industry toward electrification. Things will look different in 2030 or 2035, but 2026, if you own an SUV, you're fine. If you want to buy one, you can. The government is not coming for your Tahoe. Don't believe the headlines, verify the facts. I'll see you in the next one.